So today's question is, what is the difference between a value that you've chosen and a value that you just inherit? Which I think is an interesting question. And usually when I talk about, the place where values sit, uh it's not really either of these options. It's not that the values are chosen, nor that the values are necessarily inherent, or at least when it comes to authentic. Rather, my view of things is that you don't actually choose your values, that you sort of have an innate or inherent, you could say, value hierarchy or value arrangement that I guess you could say in one sense or another is abstract and then becomes concrete through your actions. And it's not, I think that the values are always sort of there inherently, but the process of discovering what you really value is a process of experimentation and testing and sort of updating, meaning that we have an understanding of what we think we want and what we think we'll value. And this is kind of like an idea that we have in our head or a picture that we have in our head. And then from that picture, we try to act for it, right? We try to act for the sake of it. And then in one way or another, we try to test it or verify the results of our behavior and actually creating that value in our life, and then seeing whether or not that value has any real value to us, right? So, I can give you a kind of silly personal example, but I remember when I was really young, oh man, I really wanted to make video games, right? I had played them, I thought they were so cool. I'm like, I want to go make video games, right? So what I did was I went and took a class on coding, which is something that you need to make video games with. And I think I think I spent the whole year in this coding class as I think it was like an elective or something like that. And it was one of the most boring experiences that I've ever had in my life. And I would often just ditch the actual schoolwork to go play video games on the computer or something like that, because the actual work of making a video game is actually really tedious and really boring. And so, what did my experience teach me? It taught me I like to play video games, but I don't actually like the process of creating those video games. But of course, I didn't know what went into it, so I had to test it, experiment, and learn. And that was kind of all happening automatically. But there is this internal reference point, right? There's this internal reference point in terms of what's going to be valuable and what's not going to be valuable. And I really don't think we have any control. We can't sort of just decide that we're going to value something. So I don't think there really is a place for something called chosen value. And I'm skeptical, we could say, about inherited values, because the values of your society or your parents or your culture, there are all sorts of instances in which given individuals, they have one particular kind of value environment, if you will, but they go in an entirely different direction than the values of their society or their parents. And oftentimes the wave makers, so to speak, of society are these kinds of people who break with the values of their society. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who, at the very least, act as though they value certain things tied with the culture. And part of that may be authentic. It's not necessarily a problem with acting for the sake of the values of the culture. Part of it might just be training, meaning like taking on these values and assuming them is kind of how you survived as a kid to one extent or another. And now they've sort of become an unexamined habit within yourself that you really just don't think about. But those wouldn't represent like social values that you don't experience as actually valuable when they're manifested, wouldn't be what I would consider to be an authentic or a true value. I think it's something like, I don't know about I don't know if I would use the word genetics, but there's some sort of you come into the world with some set of values that haven't been particularized, right? They haven't been made objective in the world, and some of those values can't be made objective in the world, right? If you want to, oh, I want to become like a fairy, right? Or a unicorn. I can't do that because there's no such thing as fairies or unicorns, right? So, but people have values that they just can't achieve in their own life. They have values that they think are valuable to them, but then when they actually go out and try to pursue those values, or they actually get those values, they find out, oh, that I didn't actually want this. And some people can double down out of pride or whatnot, but for the most part, people then go off, or at least authentically inclined people go off and explore new values, so they can figure out, okay, what do I really value, right? And that kind of experimenting and updating is the essence of this value transformation. And also within this sort of innate value hierarchy, or it's sort of like value instinct in a way, because it's not concrete at first, right? It only becomes concrete. It only gets laid down into conceptual analysis or conceptual understanding later on in life, years later, right? When you can start thinking about, I guess, how you tag or define these interests, right? Or what is of actually of value to you. So it's not solid, it's not objectified at first, but it is in one sense innate. You're born with a certain set of values that are arranged hierarchically that compete with one another on a moment to moment basis, based on what actual available means you have to any given kind of value, what your circumstances are, what is most likely to actually be able to be achieved in that moment. What can you act for? What you can't act for? Your body is kind of always, or your mind is always running this tally about, okay, what values do we have, and how do they relate or conflict with one another, and what's the greatest value that we can achieve, given our option, given our time horizon, all this kind of stuff. So people have the experience of conflicting values, they have the experience of like shifting values, but it's very much like Kierkegaard said, if you look backwards, you can kind of see the meaning of your life, right? You can see like the values that are trying to be worked out objectively throughout your history. And you really can only understand yourself backwards because, of course, you don't know the future, and it's only through time going forward that you can actually experiment with these kinds of innate values. So, chosen values, I don't think there's any such thing as a chosen value. I think the idea that we could sort of create ourselves is just nonsense, because even the desire to create oneself is self-value. And you don't really see like the advocates of free values like Nietzsche, or start actually, breaking free of their own innate personality and values themselves. Uh, they're not really choosing in their experience, and most people's experience of their values is unchosen. And if you were going to choose a value, then it would have to be rooted in the value in and of itself. So there's no choosing a value. Inherited values, I think there's a case to be made that some values can be inherited, but it's it's hard to distinguish between, what is a value that you are following because you have been trained to take it on, what values you are following because your parents or your culture shared them with you, and you happen to really value them, want to embody them, or got some value out of them early on, so to speak. And which ones are sort of just values of survival, values that we take on because we sort of have to. There's a line there, right? And I think you see people conforming with social values, but that's not the same thing as to say that they authentically value the things that they have to conform. And in fact, most people have the experience of being at odds with society and cultural norms. So I'm not sure about the degree of all of that. I think, again, values are innate. They're sort of generalizable, right? Like survival is a generalizable value within yourself that represents itself as really an instinct rather than a concept. And then from day to day, you objectify that value of survival through your behavior. You test and experiment and gather information, predict the future, and how you can continue that value of survival. Innately understand the hierarchical nature of the place of that value, so that you need to survive in order to pursue any other kind of values. There's a bit of a hierarchy, meaning that when I don't know, maybe I don't know, the thrill of jumping off a cliff, right, can be could be of value to you, but because it threatens your life, you're going to refrain from doing that because you value your life, and maybe you go bungee jumping or something like that, right? That's sort of a synthesis of values there that you explore and experiment with. But yeah, I would say that's my basic answer.